We're making these decisions for some specific reasons. We make every decision really with the long-term health of Xbox in mind. And what happens when an industry doesn't grow?
Microsoft cutting almost 2,000 jobs at Activision Blizzard.
But in no way were we alone in that.
Just this week, the video game streaming site Twitch announced 500 job cuts, and software company Unity said it's cutting 1,800, a quarter of its workforce.
And this ambition kind of also drove us to kind of try things that maybe we shouldn't try.
And so I think that just shows you that we got inefficient.
The workers, the people who are actually doing the day-to-day work of developing the games, they are laid off.
I might get the email saying like, no, we no longer need you.
Today's your last day, goodbye.
Not a stable industry wherever you go, whether it's AAA or even in indie spaces.
Boy, do we have a show for you.
Hello, and thank you for watching. My name is Perry. This is Played Off. It's an interview series with those affected by the layoffs in the video game industry. Joining me today is Andrea Saravia Pérez, a former writer at Firaxis. Since then, she's shipped a variety of projects at Small Lone Studio and leads the narrative department at Anima Interactive, while being a project manager at Solar Vault Studio. Andrea, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's been a long Monday, but I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and thank you for being here and being willing to talk about your experience kind of writ large. Before we jump into anything regarding, state of industry, layoffs, the reason we're here today, what got you into games?
What got me into games, it was so early on. I think my first game was by accident. Grand Theft Auto when I was 4 years old, and my parents, my dad and I think my uncle kind of like left the controller, and I kind of like grabbed it. I thought it was a racing game, but then I just had this sort of like passion for storytelling since I was very young. I was writing sort of like these comics, or I was just talking about mythology. Like all of these stories just revolved around my childhood, and it was a passion that I had early on. I came across games like Sonic Heroes, Little Big Planet was also very good at sort of like unlocking you can sort of like create things inside of the game. But I didn't piece 1 and 2 together, that you could be a storyteller in games, until college, where I believe there was a project by a foundation where they wanted us to pitch. It was like a paid project for students in a program that the art school had at the time. And I was just called like, oh yeah, you're the writing person. And I didn't know that the writing person could also be a game writer, could also be a narrative designer, until a few semesters later where I took a game writing class. And ever since then, I was networking a lot, went to a lot of game jams, and within networking, I found a mentor who led me sort of like, it's like, hey, did you notice that Firaxis is hiring? And I applied, and I was a writer at Firaxis in 2022 up until 2023.
So just kind of the natural pipeline between you have a passion for games from a young early age, and then it wasn't so much intentionally trying to pair the two, it was more just you found out you could do that, and that's what made sense.
Yeah, and I've always been someone that, like, when I put my mind into something, I find a way to do it. Mm-hmm. And so I managed to sort of like, get my degree. And then right after college, I got the job at Firaxis, and it was just like so fun. If I wasn't working on a project there, then I was just working on like personal projects, twines, game jams, like on the side. And exploring too, because storytelling is not just, through narrative design, but it's also through environmental design, like talking to the artist during a game jam, like, hey, what if we sort of like had this house, have sort of like, indents as if somebody like punched through it. Or, hey, what if, for example, sound designer, can we get like a creaking effect so that conveys the story that the house is very old and not a new one, right? So story is all over a game, and as a narrative designer, it felt like it to be a task to just kind of like see what each department and discipline is trying to do and just kind of like enable them while also adding lore, dialogue, story, barks, so on and so forth, world building. That's sort of like a very brief breakdown of the many things that I did in that period.
Yeah, definitely. So it's that idea of being a point of, I guess, harmony between a bunch of the different departments, you know. I mean, story is one of the vehicles of telling the game. So yeah, it makes sense that story has a hand across all the different departments for sure. So you're working at Firaxis and you are there until about Memorial Day 2023 or so. What is happening? We don't have to talk about specifics about what you were doing there at the time, but what is kind of the day in, day out responsibilities that you're tasked with?
As a writer, I was tasked with just sort of like story, dialogue, and characters, just sort of very general stuff. Like I literally often just read off of my job description because it's an unannounced project, right? I would just sort of like, you know, start my day, live on a spreadsheet as all narrative designers do. And I'd get a text message from a colleague that they were let go of. And I was surprised. Soon after, you sort of like, get one message and then it's sort of like, suddenly you have a Zoom meeting with HR and someone else. And then I was let go of. And at this point, I only had the equipment that Firaxis gave me, because as an employee, you get sort of like a computer and this and that to navigate stuff. So I was pretty much left laid off and without a computer. And this also happens the week after a family member passed away, because at that point I did not have very healthy work habits, completely on me though. And I only took time off when a family member passed away and I requested bereavement, and then I get back to work like that, on Tuesday because Memorial Weekend again, and I'm let go of. So how I navigate situations is just sort of like, okay, it happened. How do you find a solution? Like, what can you do from now? So I contact my partner, now my spouse, and I basically, tell them what had happened. I also follow up and try to connect, because that's another thing, sort of like, when you're let go of in these situations, I recommend that you try in like those 3 minutes that you have before like Slack is just kind of like completely shut off, to get the contact information of like those colleagues that, always had your back, to have kind of like a support system after, the event. Yeah, I basically told my partner and we start sort of like figuring out, because we have to ship the equipment, like the PC and a laptop from Firaxis to the company. We split between the two of us to get a gaming PC that we're co-owners of, which is how I'm talking to you right now.
Right.
Yeah, it was a lot, it was just sort of like, just one thing after the other, just grab an Uber, go to his workplace, and then we get a ride from a friend to Best Buy, get a PC, just kind of like, we worked fast amidst everything that was happening. It was definitely a lot that happened throughout that, that less than 8 hours, I think. Yeah.
Were there any kind of warning signs or red flags that you could see that this was a possibility that Firaxis was looking at, or was it just completely out of left field?
So the thing is, it's like, regarding like the red flags, recall that this is the time period where like Amazon's laying off people, Microsoft is laying off people, so it's like, it's making the news. Being laid off in tech or gaming by that point felt like of a when and not an if. Regardless of the company, like regardless of like how stable a company was, for like, I am somebody who's just kind of like often like paranoid, quite frankly. It doesn't surprise you. That's the sad part. It doesn't surprise you because it's just such a common occurrence, in gaming. You'll be like, it's almost like it's a traumatizing experience where like, the common, what happened to me at least is sort of like just being in sheer denial too, where the logical part of me understood that it was a matter of if, not when. But then also just like the tie that I had was oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You know,
it's
in
trying to
hindsight,
find
you
the
can.
balance of the two. Yeah.
Yeah, in hindsight, it's like, of course it was gonna happen. Unfortunately, it sucks. It was traumatizing. Yes, that's pretty much like the best way to kind of like navigate it. Where like it wasn't necessarily just an exclusive of just like, you know, that company. It was just kind of like in general, the industry was just leading towards that.
Do you feel like there's any room for anyone to feel secure? Because you had mentioned, yeah. Not that everyone should be panicking and freaking out if you have a job in games, but it's scary.
Unfortunately, that's not the case. I think that, imagine that we were in the early days of Disney and, you know, there were layoffs at Disney, right? Do you think they would lay off Walt Disney?
No.
There you go. So, without naming names, like figures that almost represent a company are the ones that I've noticed to be safe. But also, even then, there have been cases where they've been kicked off. So it's one of those where even a Walt Disney figure like has been, you know, affected by these. It's sort of like the sad reality, and it's not me being a pessimist. It's just me sort of like, you know, seeing colleagues across a variety of studios affected. You always like there's people that are updating their portfolio every month, and I highly recommend that because I think this could be a good segue where I'm laid off and the work that I'm super proud of is entirely under NDA, right? In college, I was incredibly busy, and though I try to polish my portfolio to the best of my ability, it was during college, so it was primarily assignments. Assignments that, you know, Firaxis liked. I remember one of them being, like, or rather, like a writing sample that a lot of folks, like, you know, whenever I'm going through the process, end up being interested by is a D&D supplement where you can play as if you were in Dante's Inferno in like the different levels. And then also there's like characters from like the Divine Comedy. So, you know, I'm proud of that sample, but that's a sample that has my college, like it displays how good of a writer I was in college, but it doesn't display how good of a writer I was after having worked in AAA. There's this period where you kind of like have to just immediately go into like, once we had the PC, of course, and, you know, could just have a monitor because it's not just kind of like getting the PC itself. You need to get a monitor and stuff. I had to sort of like just do an entire, just from scratch, my portfolio, and I keep revamping it over and over, you know, because I was laid off for a while. Like I was laid off since, you know, Memorial Weekend 2023, but I didn't have the jobs that I do right now until December. So it was a while.
Right.
It was a while where I just kept polishing over and over.
And that's not an uncommon thing that I've heard. Games take, especially in the AAA space, so long to make now that dev cycles of 6, 7, 8 years, you know, it's not unheard of. That's kind of the norm at these higher levels. And if you are hired there and you're only there 3 years, sometimes you don't have anything that you can showcase in your portfolio because you're under NDA.
There was, you know, the time period where, like, you know, I would have writing samples from 2020, 2021, but I had already been in AAA for like about a year. So my writing had improved, but I couldn't prove it through writing samples. And you can never get a job by just going, trust me, bro, I got this, to like, you know, a recruiter.
Right.
So a good problem to have, and something that I've noticed with the layoffs, is the outpouring support from the game development community. And it's very valued, and I think we should keep it going, of course, with the caveat that it's a traumatizing experience to be laid off. And there's a lot of things that you have to put in order. You have to sort of like, you know, get the severance checks in, you know, place. You need to sort of like ship the equipment and then find equipment if you didn't have any aside the company equipment, as was my case. And then you have to like, you know, have your portfolio just completely overhaul entirely. So there were some very kind recruiters who sort of like, you know, offered to assist me, and they did. But I had to sort of like let them know like, hey, life is happening. Because it wasn't just that I'm navigating grief from like, you know, a family member passing away, me having to go to their funeral and then coming back to a layoff, but then somebody broke into my house, but then sort of like, like there was, life was happening. Character growth against my will happened within 2 weeks. It feels sometimes that people are just looking at spreadsheets and then just letting go of numbers, and they see employees as like the cost of their paycheck. But the reality is that it's a human being. It's a human being with a life. It's a human being with a family. It's a human being that may depend on the healthcare of that role that is full-time and is incredibly scarce, because with every single layoff that happened, there's more competition. And then people are graduating, and so, people who are laid off and at a junior role have this additional, competition. It's hard, but people need time when they're laid off. So like if somebody doesn't reply to you or if you offer like help, just know that there's a lot happening in the background.
Right. People get laid off and they just need time to process. It can be a really idealistic approach to imagine going from one role that inflicted trauma on you through a layoff to immediately thinking about your next role. People need time to process that and live.
And there's such like minor things that become like you have to communicate early on, like I don't like being approached that way because of the layoff. Because for example, the other day there was an interesting conversation where like a colleague of mine said, if you are in a position of like manager or like lead or what have you, you need to remove entirely from your vocabulary, can I call you for 5 minutes? Can you hop on a call for 5 minutes? Yes. Everybody watching this, and I am so sorry for the viewers, y'all just had PTSD, didn't you?
Yeah. I had it. I felt that.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, no. The moment that, it triggers the fight or flight, it messes you up, and you don't realize it until sort of like when you have a role, even if it's outside of gaming, even if it's in a customer service job, because that's the other thing I tell people, like, get that non-gaming job fast. Get a non-gaming job first, and then, continue the job hunt. Because we're currently in a situation where, these companies are having like 5 stages for narrative design. They have like written tests that take 2 weeks, like even if they say that it's a very competitive field, and the waiting times between like when you apply and when you actually get the job is insane, and you have to pay bills. But as people post layoff navigate being in a corporate environment again, they realize these small things like that, those phrases have a much bigger impact after the layoff than anybody could have predicted.
Well, even just as someone who has experienced things like anxiety, there's no, I haven't been through a layoff personally, but there's nothing that strikes fear into my heart faster than start of the day, hey, do you have time to talk at the end of the day? That's all I'm going to be thinking about for the entirety of that day. It's a horrifying thing. So I agree with you, managers, please take that out of your vocabulary. No one wants to hear that.
And also, like, post layoff, I'm just going to say, in general, I don't know of a single game developer that is comfortable with the phrase, with like the word restructuring.
I imagine redundancy is going to be a big one. A lot of times you'll hear that
shifting
thrown
priorities.
away.
Yeah, no, like it's sort of like it's just these many words, phrases where like people need to be very wary of them, and in the best case scenario, avoid them entirely, because unfortunately, a lot of developers are going to have like a negative reaction, as we just did. The 5-minute call sends a chill down my spine every single time. A thesaurus is a thing. A synonym is a thing. Please find something that means redundant but is not redundant.
Right. Something that is not going to bring up, past traumas for people, definitely. I would love to talk about your experience after the layoff, because you were let go in May, and then you said it was around December that you had found new work. Did you have one of the, you mentioned the non-game industry job. Is that something you turned to for a while for bills?
Yeah.
Or what is that range of 7 months?
The calendar is foggy, because so much happened in like the span of a year. I would network for, at my worst, where it's gonna sound weird, like how can you burn yourself out, Andrea, when you don't have a job? Well, when you network for 17 hours a day for a prolonged period of time, and you're just trying to just connect with other people, find leads, like the second part's not as important as just trying to find that connection, that just even showing up to a stand-up and then seeing the familiar faces there broad. Because that's the other thing. A layoff when you're a remote employee hits a lot different than when you live, say, in the area. You can still grab a cup of coffee with people that were in the vicinity of that or whatever city like a studio might be based in. But when you're remote and in a different state, you don't have that. And I was sending hundreds of job applications. I honestly stopped counting after 600, but it's easily in the 4 digits of how many applications I sent out. Spent time catering the cover letters, catering the resumes, where I was qualified for the jobs. I knew I had the qualifications, but it's small things where, for example, if somebody's hiring for a narrative designer, then you have to write narrative designer and not game writer as a role. I had leads, I had connections, I even had referrals, and I was really grateful for them, but I didn't see any results until after the Game Developers of Color Expo, like the conference, where I managed to connect with some very kind recruiters and got interviews, because that's the other thing. I could probably count in one hand how many interviews I got throughout this entire period. And
were majority of them from the recruiters that you were able to connect with? Like out of the 4-digit plus resumes and applications you sent out, did a lot of those turn up in interviews, or was it more about your connections? Okay.
No, that was so I started getting the interviews after, after I went to GDoc, to the Game Developers of Color conference, because Latina. I was reached out recently by somebody who goes to my alma mater, and they were nervous because they're like, hey, after you graduated, what has the job hunt be like? Because the prospects are not looking good. And after Firaxis, I got a certification that thankfully was kind of paid by the company from the narrative department, which is a intensive game writing class regarding narrative design. So I had that certification and 20 other certifications, either similar or in different fields that I had qualifications in, because I have more time in marketing than I do in games, for example. I am pursuing a master's in learning technologies, which can be applied to when you're doing tutorials. So it's a little bit game adjacent. I learned 4 programming languages, and I've been able to create dialogue systems in 2 different game engines, and I know 4 different game engines, and I was vocal about that while being a polyglot. This is not to flex. This is to highlight that I have the experience, I had studio experience, a degree that corresponded with what I was applying for, and this knowledge and these certifications and connections, but I was not landing any jobs.
Yeah, you just listed off a whole range of stuff that would probably make you an ideal candidate at hundreds of places, and you still had to send out thousands of applications. It's not a great spot. I think your friend from your alma mater was definitely right to feel a little wary about the state of things.
And that's some people have heard the mantra of survival 25, because I believe the prospects are looking brighter by that year. But that's I try to sort of communicate my story to just sort of let people know of the state of the industry, the type of candidate that I am, and how hard for like a long period of time it was. I was doing game journalism, I was freelancing, like I was very fortunate to have like gigs and sort of like, I also had this trust from people. I did a lot of game jams. So many. Ooh, yeah, the moment that I was free, nah, I was just kind of like, I think at one point I was doing 5 game jams at a certain point at the same time, and my friend was like, Andrea, you may want to drop a few of them, and I'm like, you're right. So I did, and I just kind of like focused on game jams and just organizing them. So I did a bit of a crazy thing in November, which was that I asked, the alumni of the narrative department, like somebody had asked if they wanted to do a game jam, and I was kind of like always asking people if they wanted to do a game jam, who wants to do a game jam, because of course I'm unemployed. I have time to kill, right? And by then I had done a handful of game jams and a handful of projects, and they were just like 20 people responded. Initially it's like, how do we do this? Do we have like different groups? And I basically went, hear me out. I know this sounds crazy, but I think it's doable if we do, for example, a visual novel. Visual novel, it's basically kind of self-explanatory, where like, it's pretty much a game where you kind of just like click and then you just have dialogue and like, the 2 characters or more. There can be more characters. But I organized a Discord server and I had roles for like different disciplines, because the other thing too, it's like I knew that my colleagues there were multi-hyphenates. Like they did writing and narrative design, but they also knew production, or they did narrative design and they also did art, narrative design and also programming. Like that's the other thing about narrative design, where like it's so competitive that we're always trying to have like other skills, like I just sort of like listed, to be able to stand out to a recruiter. So if you ever need somebody who's like, a jack of all trades, you go to a narrative designer, because we're struggling out here getting as many. We're trying to get skills and new things to learn as if they were Pokemon. So I basically, said, okay, let's grab the pipeline similar to a studio and implement it in this game jam that's going to last a month. We were planning, having pre-production essentially for 2 weeks, I believe. Just sort of like, assigning roles to people, where people said like, hey, I want to do writing, or I want to do editing, I want to do programming, and everybody was kind of like, getting their roles assigned. And we also, the way we decided on the story was kind of like by having like a pitching competition. So the person that, people voted for became the narrative lead. Because you can't just have like a bunch of writers, editors, like sound designers. As much as I love the flat organization structure in like any project, when you have 20 plus people, you need sort of like, a narrative lead, like somebody who's kind of like overseeing. You need like a sound lead, programming lead, and you also need like a production lead, project manager, that sort of stuff. It sounds like corporate bullshit, and I hated saying that, but I was kind of like, listen, y'all, we're like 20 people. We need to figure this out somehow. And then there's somebody who called. They're like, I remember being in the car with my husband and my grandmother-in-law, and it's like, hey, I think we need and somebody said that they needed a creative director, and I'm like, oh, who wants to do that? And they're like, you. So I joked that I'm the democratically chosen creative director for that project, which became Santa's Secret, which was a visual novel. It's out now, and so is another project by what we call ourselves, Small Own Studio. The thing about it, Harry, is that a lot of people want to be in narrative design, but then once they get the job as a narrative designer, not a lot of people know what the job's day-to-day entails. They don't know that you have to report to a narrative lead. They don't know what the pipeline is like. Like, what's the role of a narrative designer during pre-production? What's the role in production, and then post-production? Like, there's a lot of unknowns. And yes, you can teach them to a person on the job, like it happened to me. But if you can just teach it to somebody before they get a job, it makes it so much easier to do that transition. And additionally, in my opinion, this is just my personal opinion, there's some good ones. There's some that do a good job. Generally speaking, there's not a lot of resources for narrative leads or mid-level narrative designers. What I mean by this is, when you're a narrative lead or a lead of any discipline, right? Your job, instead of being sort of like, say, 100% or 80% writing for the game, it becomes one part is like management and another part is narrative design. And people don't know about the management part. People management is like a beast. Like it takes a lot of experience and trial and error. And so there's not a lot of good onboarding for that. And there's not a lot of resources, because there's a lot of resources that are either, here's how do you break into the industry, or, hi everybody, I have 30 years of experience in this industry and you're gonna hear about all the titles I've done. And so for us in like the middle, right, there wasn't much. So I wanted to give the folks at Small Own Studio just the chance to like see, hey, do you like sort of like, being a narrative lead? Do you prefer staying as a narrative designer? Or like, what workflow works best for you? Right? And we rotate sort of like, the roles around so that people can just try different things, because that's what it's there for. It's for people to like learn what they like to do while kind of simulating what it's like in a studio, and having this huge project at the end that's complete from a game jam that they can have on their portfolio.
You described Small Own Studios as less of a traditional studios before we hopped on the call, and more of a collective. And after hearing you describe that, I definitely agree with that. That's a really unique opportunity to let people wear many hats and build up different skills that they might not have gotten. I think you're right in that a lot of the times management is management because they've just worked in the industry for a long time and maybe they don't have the right leadership skills. So the idea of having a safe space and like this collective to build up those skills, that is awesome.
Yeah, people management it's just tricky. So I try to sort of like let people know about, hey, I do believe that the people in Small Own Studio have a lot of talent, and I do believe that once the market is looking a little brighter, it's a matter of if, not when they land a job, right? But then jobs have growth, and there's not a lot of resources that allow you to navigate that career growth. So I think just letting them know early on the difference between like a narrative lead, narrative designer, and sort of like different skill sets that are involved in those titles just sort of like helps out. I would not have imagined being in the position that I am now after the layoff. There was a lot of imposter syndrome that happened. And I think there was a test going around of sort of like, what type of narrative designer are you? Where like it's actually by somebody and it's backed by data and what have you, of like, is your style more of like narrative director? Is your style more of like a game writer, which is different from a narrative designer? Or are you a narrative technical designer? All of these different things. And when I input it, like I wrote down what I like doing, it came out as a narrative lead. And I'm like, yeah, I am a narrative lead. Yeah, that is my title. Yeah, I signed a contract. Yeah, I am a narrative lead. But a year ago, I would not have believed that. I really would not have believed that would be the case. That was something that, you expect like 2, 3, 4 years down the line. So I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I am now. Very fortunate to sort of like, work for not one, but 2 studios, which is crazy. There's just been a lot of growth and a lot of opportunities. I got to go to GDC thanks to 2 scholarships. Had a lot of fun meeting my friends from the Bay Area. And weirdly, my East Coast colleagues, where I'm just like, you're telling me you're an Amtrak away from me and it takes an entire trip to San Francisco for us to meet in person? Come on.
Yeah.
Come on. Right?
Right.
No, yeah, there's definitely been a lot of growth, and like some of my peers have gone on to like found their own studios. Like I feel like that was a huge takeaway, where like you need to kind of like do your own thing to succeed in the industry, and that's something that I think is like a very interesting notion that a lot of people were echoing.
How are people making these independent projects happen, doing their own thing? I'm under the idea personally that funding for these things, because you need funding to make a job work.
It all depends, right? So, for example, like in Small Own Studio, a lot of folks have are just like, they're so talented, they have the skills, and I know that they would just like succeed and nail it the moment they get a job in the industry, right? But unfortunately, they're transitioning from one industry to the other, so they don't really have any game studio experience, or they're very early on in their career, so like there's, it's more of like people would have to take a chance on them. I hate that phrase, but that's sort of like what happens with junior talent. The way that I've been making games, it's just sort of like, we just go from one month-long game jam to the other. We did Santa's Secret for the Winter Visual Novel Game Jam, and then afterwards we recently, like literally yesterday, released the Ouroboros Express, which is available on itch.io right now. So we're very happy and super proud about what we've accomplished, because they're large games, but they're games that we kind of like do with the mentality that it's very difficult to get a job right now, so I might as well polish my portfolio so that when the jobs are available, and prosperity is sort of like emerging from like all of these startups, right? Because it's all over the news, like it's BioWare, it's Volition, like it's something, like it's Insert Studio. They're always founding so many different studios. I think that once the ball gets rolling and there is funding across all of these different studios, because like you see the number of layoffs that have happened. Do not even ask me. I don't know what the number is. I know it's big.
Yeah.
But of those, a lot of people do have sort of like the resume and like the pitch deck to be able to prove to like investors, VCs, publishers, accelerators, or whatever it is that they choose to go with, that yes, you can trust your money in my hands, and I'll make you a game that's gonna, give me and you money. When the growth of these sort of like small studios keep sort of like gaining momentum, that's when I think that we're gonna have a lot of people being able to find a job and an opportunity that in the meantime we're just kind of like polishing and working on our portfolios.
Kind of like a rebuilding season.
Yeah. And again, this is all a guess as somebody who's sort of like, it was great sort of like seeing, so many new studios, and it's on the news, and even colleagues of mine. So, but to answer like, where's the money? Like, the money's there. It's not a question of, is there money? It's a question of like, how do you tell the person that has the money that they can trust you?
So you're optimistic about the industry. All of this to say that... Is that a yes? Is that a no? Optimistic about maybe the future of the industry? Maybe not where it's at right now?
About the future, yes, is the short answer. But the longer answer is that we also have to bear in mind that there's a low chance of indie studios flourishing. What happens when people do the pivot from sort of like, AAA to like, building their own studio is that they realize, oh, this is what the company was shielding me from. As an employee at Firaxis, I didn't have to worry about the cost of operations. I didn't have to worry about HR, about issuing sort of like 1099s. Like, there's so much, in the granular part of like, having a studio and having employees, not just contractors, but like employees, freelancers, contractors. Like, there's a lot that goes into like having a studio that a lot of people were kind of like shielded from. So, yes, I do believe that there's going to be sort of like, essentially like a boom and like a renaissance, if you will, of these studios. But then also it's the studios that understand like, what handling operations is like, what handling, payroll is going to be like, how to budget, and how to sort of like, have a burn rate that does not deplete, the money that is either crowd raised or that is obtained by investors. Like, there's many things that go behind the scenes. Those that understand what goes behind the scenes, I definitely have faith in them that they're gonna like succeed and just knock it out of the park. But the reality is that it's complicated.
Yeah.
even if it's remote, right? Like even when it's remote, like it's kind of like, okay, but then are we allowed to hire somebody from this jurisdiction or from that state? Do we like? So, because then it's sort of like, you might have to pay taxes in different states, and how does that work? There's a lot that goes behind the scenes of a studio that I feel like more people need to sort of like be aware of before they kind of like commit. Like, listen, I'm not thinking of founding a studio anytime soon. Every now and then there's going to be an article, and who doesn't want to, read a little bit of what goes behind the scenes, right? Like, isn't it everybody's dream at some point where it's just like, I cannot find a job. I don't have studio experience. But if I made my own studio, maybe, I can get that loophole, solved, right? So I understand that, and I'm just here to tell people, like, I was also like in the point where I was just like, what if I just said, pardon my French, fuck it, and made my own studio, right? But then you sort of like do the math, and it's like, can I pay taxes here and there and this and that, and then having to like pay for the software, and like, because if you want to do a studio, you gotta do it good or not. Like, you go all in or not.
Right.
Like,
Aftermath has this great theme week that they just did. They called it Inside Baseball, and it was talking about their decision to, and this is games press, so less games industry proper, but split from Kotaku, where all the Aftermath people were at prior. And so this Inside Baseball week is all about, it's Inside Baseball for how Aftermath operates. And I know the person they have there, Riley, has been extremely focused on that theme week, writing about how hard it is to run a business. And that's what a studio is at an extent. It's a business. And so you do have the HR, you've got the taxes, you've got the paperwork, because that is the dream, I'm sure, for so many people, but logistically that's challenging. Do you think there's anything that employees can be doing right now within the game industry, say they're still at these AAA spaces, that they can be doing to protect themselves, better insulate against the chance of layoffs, maybe imagine some stability?
It's something that I wish I didn't have to say, because in a utopia, I want everybody that's employed to just stick to that, to just, be calm, be at ease, have some tranquility that you're employed, you're taken care of. I want that to be the reality. It's not at the moment. So always keep updating your portfolio. If you feel like a studio is not giving you the role or the position, I'm not going to assume, but I always recommend people like, hey, go where you think that, you feel you might be treated better. Which is very risky, I admit, it's sort of like, it's a kind of like an old adage that I've heard where it's like the best time to be job hunting is when you have a job,
Right.
But it's one of those where like, the older generation tells you that shit. Know your rights as an employee. Like, as an employee, there are labor rights, there's behavior that's unacceptable. Definitely try to contact people who know about that. There's a lot of resources, I believe, that IATSE, CWA, and other unions are kind of like putting out.
Andrea, as we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything that you're looking to plug, whether it's resources for people to look for, things that you've been a part of, just anything at all?
If you've been affected by a layoff, there is a Discord server that is volunteer run for international employees who have been affected by the layoffs. It has recommendations and stuff, because what I feel like is left out of the layoff conversation is that there are people whose livelihoods, as in can they stay in the States, is dependent on their employer. Like they have like a 1 month margin to like, either find a job or go back to their home countries. There's a game industry Slack channel. It's very active. There's additionally, Amir Satvat also has good resources. This sounds very shameless, but I do have a couple of job hunting resources that are like in my featured page on LinkedIn, just so that people can, learn about, because I know about like 16 job searching websites that I believe I put all of them, in that resource stuff, and it's also tailored to anyone in the industry. And speaking of something tailored for everybody in the industry, there's a narrative consultancy that I lead, Renaissance Hat Productions. We have our Discord server. We're trying to help out as many folks as we can. So whether you're a student, you're trying to break into the industry, you want to learn more, you want to connect with people, if you've been affected by a layoff, and a lot of things are just not told to you, like, should I get Cobra, should I not? There's a lot of things, and if you have any of those questions, if you want a resume, cover letter, any of those just updates, We have a Discord server specifically for that. And we do have additionally 4 job bots that always sort of like ping people whenever there's kind of like an opportunity across different regions, not just America. And one of the job bots also includes what I call sort of like, in between gigs, where it's like, sure, sometimes people, have a game jam and they have like $100 to spare to get a level designer. So those are gigs that I recommend that, you kind of like take on because you might get a portfolio piece out of them, and it allows you kind of like weather the storm that is just sort of like navigating unemployment, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm very accessible there. If anybody has any questions just about like navigating the market, I do also offer career coaching, totally optional. I don't think that career growth should be paywalled, basically. So I try to cater it to where like, I value my labor, but then also I don't think there should be like a huge paywall. So I always set up, payment plans that, work accordingly to the needs of whoever is interested in it. Everything from calculators, so if you're a narrative designer and you're writing for visual novels, you can calculate what your rate would be depending on how many years of experience you have and what the word count is like. We also have resources such as making it ATS friendly, and I don't really put like a limit on how many meetings people want, because I'm like, some people charge per consultation. I don't like that. It's just like, just pay me a flat fee and like we're good. You know what I mean? Because it's like, people are always striving to improve, and I love that, and I want to help with that. So yeah. Also, last thing, Ouroboros Express is out, and I was a sound lead in it. So go and play it. We're gonna have the itch.io page. It has 51,000 or over 51,000 words. 40 people were working on it in a game jam for a month, and we're super excited that it's out. That's pretty much it for me.
Yeah, hey, absolutely. I will put the links for all of that stuff in the description here. I personally have every episode plugged the game industry job hunt Slack channel, amirsatvat.com.
So and during the weekend, if you want to play as a dinosaur, there's also Untamed, which has a demo out on Steam, and I kind of manage that project. If you are really into dinosaurs, which I've heard a lot of people be into. So.
Definitely. So yeah, you have the plethora of resources. I'm gonna link all of those. Any final? Oh, go ahead.
No, in games, I've worked on so many games. Oh, yeah. It's a good comment to have.
Do you have any last minute words of wisdom or anything you'd like to say before we sign off here?
It's not going to be exactly the words of wisdom you might expect, but it's something that if someone had told me earlier, it would have helped me, which is, this is going to hurt. This is going to be a painful and long journey, but this too shall pass. I'm not a fan of toxic positivity. So what I tell people, it's like, yeah, like the way that this industry is like, it's not gonna be very fun for a long time, but it's not gonna stay like this perpetually. I don't know when it's gonna change. I don't have, like a ball where a crystal ball to, predict that. Now's the time to study. Now's the time to polish your portfolio. Now's the time to network. And for the love of God, please just network with people as if they were humans. Don't just say like, oh my God, I met a recruiter. Just go like, yeah, I met so-and-so. Like they have a name. Just try to sort of like, foster those connections, polish your portfolio, because this industry fucking sucks a little bit right now. But it's not gonna suck. When? Who knows? 2025 seems to be the year that a lot of people are expecting it to not suck. I'm not in biz dev, so pardon my very crude way of describing, like the, everything of this industry.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I think that is great for people to hear. Like, hey, it might suck now. It's not always going to suck. Take the opportunity now to make sure you're better equipped for when it doesn't suck as much. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for being on. Like I said, links will be in the description of this when it's up on YouTube for all those resources you mentioned. And yeah, play Ouroboros Express. I am going to check that out immediately after we end the recording here. So thank you.
And try Untamed. Demo's out and we're working on early access.
Absolutely. But yeah, that's about it for today. I've been Perry Gottstruck. This has been Andrea Saravia Pérez, and thank you. Have a great day. Bye.